Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 14 today after the woman has finally gotten to David to understand what's going on in our scene. And so as we continue in verse 18, suddenly it will shift from David talking to the wise woman of Tekoa to David speaking with Joab with no transition or segue of any kind, and the woman just seems to disappear like magic as Joab appears in her place. So I'll have to hear how that plays out as we go. And I'm not showing the connections I've been making throughout chapter 13 and 14 with both the previous scene in 2 Samuel 11 and 12 and between 13 and 14 themselves, because it's so closely connected and we've seen so much of it that there's nothing in particular about this scene I need to connect there. Rather, instead, let's focus on the sequence we've been looking at in our scene and how it shifts so much in our situation here. So at the beginning, the king simply opened up with what is with you, and notice throughout, as we've been noting, it's king, king, king. He's never mentioned as David anywhere throughout here. So it's in his official role, even though plainly he's also a father. Although, as we'll see, he'll refer to Absalom, to Joab, as the young man, which he'll also refer to him as in chapter 18, rather than my son. But when he's dead, he will cry out, my son, Absalom, my son. So he asked her, she told the story that we recognize and similar to the Cain and Abel story. He deferred a ruling and said, basically, go to your house and I'll get back to you later. Then she pushed him a little more, and he claimed that he would protect her from being touched, but that wasn't the real issue. So she pushed him some more, and he finally acknowledged, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground, which ironically echoes what will happen to Absalom in chapter 18, as we'll see. And then he asked her, she asked to speak one more time, and he says, speak again. And then finally she gets the accusation out, and we looked at that last time. And we'll hear at the end here, the king will hear and rescue his handmaid from the hand of the man who would destroy both me and my son from the heritage of God. And that's what she hopes he will do. And now we're in our scene. And now finally it'll shift, and the king will say to her, don't withhold anything from me. And she says, you speak. So he's been speaking almost nothing throughout, just one sentence at a time, and really not responding to her complex rhetoric, which we've been noting sometimes is eloquent and sometimes is completely convoluted. It has allowed scholars to really struggle to figure out what the sequence is. But now it's crystal clear, and that's what we want to focus on here, because she's been a stand-in for Joab all along. Unlike the parallel situation in chapter 12 where Nathan told a story that didn't involve him directly, that was supposed to get David thinking about what he did with Uriah, and it does succeed in that, this time Joab doesn't speak to him directly. And so we've been wondering all along, is she speaking Joab's words or not? So let's zoom in a little on our immediate scene here, and we'll start here in verse 18, and we'll go through 22 today. So after she said, Yahweh be with you, as sort of a closing benediction, which really sounds like she's done, then the king answered the woman. Notice it's an answer here, but it's not really an answer. So that's an interesting choice from the narrator's perspective, the writer's perspective, put in the mouth of the narrator. Do not withhold from me anything I ask you. Notice the double negative there. Do not withhold, rather than to speak directly. It's suggesting that he thinks she's got something to hide. And of course she does have something to hide, and he's onto it now. We've seen do not withhold a couple times earlier, and we'll see it one more time, literally to hide. Don't hide anything from me. So the woman said, let my lord the king speak. And we've seen throughout, my lord the king, my lord the king. As I've noted a couple of times, no one says it in a more condensed context than she does here, other than Abigail in 1 Samuel 25. So let my lord the king speak, and please, the NRC so often leaves out please and the Vehenas and behold, and we'll see that one of those in our passage right down here as well. So he finally brings it out. Is the hand of Joab with you in all this? And notice the play on hand, as we've seen, as he says, is the hand of Joab, for she said, the hand of the one who would threaten me, back up here. So right here. So to rescue her from the hand, in her fictional story, of the man who would destroy me, David calls upon the hand of Joab, who's not out to destroy anybody as far as we can tell, but he's in this. So the hand of Joab with you in this. And the woman didn't say just yes. She could have just said yes, but instead she has all these words instead of yes, highlighting again how many words are in her mouth. And we have to ask, when she says, your servant Joab, or your slave Joab, put these words in my mouth, does that include these words here? Where does it stop? We don't know. So the woman answered, again the answering back and forth, and said, as surely as you live, my lord the king, we cannot turn to right or left from anything my lord the king has said. That phrase, turn right or left, as you can see from my note down below, is a Deuteronomistic historian phrase in various forms. If we see it, for example, back in Deuteronomy 2:27, as a simple description here, if you let me pass, I will turn neither to the right or the left, to highlight a traveler who's not going to interfere with the local people. But we can also see how it's a divine element, as we see here. You must therefore be careful to do as Yahweh your God has commanded you. You shall not turn to the right or left. You shall follow exactly the path your Lord God has commanded you. And that follows along with the metaphor of the faith perspective throughout the Hebrew Scripture of walking with Yahweh. It's not like Christians understand it as having faith, but of walking in the derek Yahweh, the way of Yahweh. And so that involves not turning to the right or left to do what's right in your eyes or be distracted, but simply to follow the path. And so we see that a number of times at the beginning of Joshua, near the end of Joshua. We saw it in 1 Samuel 6:12 in a humorous situation where the cows carrying the ark turn neither to the left or the right. And we saw it one other time in 2 Samuel, and we'll see it once in 2 Kings. It's an interesting echo we'll go back to in Genesis 24:49. I'm not suggesting it's immediate echo, but since there have been so many passages in Genesis that are clearly based on stories in 1 and 2 Samuel, we hear here about the Laban speaking to Abraham's servant now then, or servant speaking to Laban rather, now then if you will deal loyally and truly with chesed ve'emet, the classic Hebrew phrase there of Yahweh, chesed, loyalty, and emet, truth, with my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, so I may turn either to the right hand or the left. So in that sense, a negative thing, that if Laban doesn't agree, he will just go back. But he does agree, and of course, the servant goes back with Rebekah. So we've seen that phrase a number of times, and it's often focused on the commands of God. And we've seen several times in this scene where she's equating my Lord the King to Yahweh. He's the one who gives commands. In this case, it's Joab who gives commands. And he's the one who's like the angel of God, and we'll see that one more time on the other side of the chiasm here. Knowing or discerning good and evil, it's not knowing there, it's listening to good and evil, but elements that would otherwise apply to God, highlighting throughout this scene that there's a question about the king as usurping Yahweh's authority in the first place, and in this case the authority of life and death, where she claimed a little earlier that Yahweh does not take a life, but will do everything possible to bring exiles back. So, continuing from here, cannot turn right or left from anything my lord the king has said, for it was your servant Joab who commanded me. It was he who put all these words into the mouth of your servant. And we have to wonder about that as we've been doing. Has she been truly faithful to this the whole time? Is she saying that to protect herself, to say, hey, don't look at me, it's Joab who's doing this? But she's a wise woman, so if she's wise, she's got to be more than just a good actor, one would expect. She's got to be able to spontaneously figure out what's going on. As with Abraham's servant, that scene I just referenced in Genesis 24, where Abraham gave him instructions but sent him on the long journey from where they were in Canaan all the way back to the old country in Paddan Aram to negotiate with a stranger over taking a daughter. So he certainly couldn't expect that he would have all the words prepared in advance. He had to be able to be spontaneous under the circumstances. And although this isn't as huge a situation as that one, still facing the king over his son who may well be rebellious involves having to know exactly what to say. So whether Joab put all the convoluted words in her mouth or she was just putting out more words to be confusing, it's hard to know. But she claims here that everything she said were Joab's words. And she says this is the reason. In order not to change the course of affairs, but as I have down here, for the sake of turning faces. And I want to highlight that because the New RSV, for whatever reason, almost always covers up the face-to-face language that we see in Genesis. And speaking of, in the Bible rather, but and speaking of Genesis as well, because one of the key echoes of the kind of face-to-face language is Jacob and Esau and the reunion there. And in some ways, Esau and Absalom are parallel in they're both focused on being hairy, although Absalom, as we'll see in the next scene, is very proud of his weighty hair, and Esau, we don't hear any feeling about he had personally about the fact that he was hairy. So there's a certain similarity there, but not a lot else. This is a father-son situation, and of course that was brothers. But the face-to-face issue is certainly one there, whether that's face-to-face with God, as Jacob says, to see your face is like seeing the face of God, or here, whether seeing a face is like seeing the angel of God, although that that parallel is not exactly made. Here it's the issue of turning faces, and we'll see one of the big issues is, will David face his son Absalom? And spoiler alert, the answer is no, he will not. So let's continue here. In order to change faces, your servant Joab did this. In other words, Joab is hoping that if David and Absalom can meet face to face, that this will cool off, that maybe Absalom will back off his desire to rebel. Maybe David will back off his anger at Absalom for killing Amnon, or for perhaps feeling like he's going to rebel and the monarchy can be held more stable. But does Joab know what we are expecting David might have planned, which is never said out loud here, that Solomon will be the successor? Joab certainly knows about Solomon, but whether he knows David's heart to know that David has his mind on Solomon, or whether we know that. Nathan will say it later in 1 Kings, but whether it's true or not, we have to each decide for ourselves. So she continues unnecessarily here, but flattering him, perhaps to protect herself. But my Lord has wisdom like the wisdom of the angel of God to know all things that are on earth. Praising him here, flattering him really for, hey, you figured it out, didn't you? Although one might wonder, why did it take him so long to figure it out? So the use of Hakim here for wisdom, echoing what we saw back in 13:3 of Jonadab, Amnon's advisor, being described as having wisdom, and 14:2 with the wisdom of the woman, and now as the angel of God, attributing a mighty large wisdom to David and exalting God at the same time. And we, as my note below continues, the wise woman praises the wise king, at least in her mind. What wisdom he has isn't clear. Is that wisdom that he just figured out the obvious? Mostly it's just flattery. But then it's highlighting knowing. And as I was noting in the last video, the word discerning is really based on listening. So what we heard here of discerning good and evil is he could listen and know good and evil, but it didn't use yada to know, and here it does. So it's really equating what the king power is here, like the angel of God on the other side of the chiasm here, good and evil with the wisdom of the angel of God to know all things. And that really, I'd suggest, echoes into Genesis, even though the authors of the garden story in Genesis 2 are obviously not dependent on an interpretation in 2 Samuel 14. But it suggests something of the cultural context, that to know good and evil is not to know good on the one hand and evil on the other. It's to know all things, everything from A to Z, as one might say, on a particular logo of a worldwide shipping company that highlights that in their name. So it's not necessarily about moral knowledge, but about all knowledge, and that's certainly what she affirms here. And so then immediately the king said to Joab, and that's why I use this cover image on the video that I show here to highlight how can this be happening unless Joab has been there all along. And he could have been listening all along without David knowing that she was his plant. Just listening because he's the king's general and he's there, whether to protect the king or just like a chief of staff to know what's going on. And we'd have no reason to be suspicious of that. So that's certainly what it seems, because the narrator doesn't intervene to say, and the king summoned Joab, or Joab walked in the room. It's just the king said to Joab. So it seems like Joab's been listening all the time. And that makes us go back and realize that she was speaking the words of Joab while he was standing right there watching and listening to see if she spoke his words or not. And would he have intervened if she said the wrong words? Well, that would have blown the cover. So we don't know that, and Joab doesn't say anything about her, doesn't say, thanks for a good job, I'll take over here. In fact, she just simply disappears. Like she wasn't there at all. No thank you to her, no you're dismissed, just gone, just out of the story, and we never hear from her again. So now the king speaks directly to Joab, very well, or literally, behold, please, as I highlight down here, as the New RSV for whatever reason leaves out, I grant this. So there's an emphasis there. Literally, I make this word. Go bring back the young man Absalom, or return here, as in verse 13. A word that's a common word, but also a common word for returning from exile there. So the young man here, not my son, and we'll see 4 times in chapter 18 when the king is inquiring about the fate of Absalom amidst the rebellion and the battle back from David's people, of what's the status of the young man Absalom, but he will not refer to him now as his son. So continuing now, Joab prostrated himself with his face to the ground, and we've seen that was a refrain throughout. So we've seen here, and we see up here she did that, and we'll see it one more time at the end of our scene. And as I note here on the verse, how different from other Joab-David conversations where Joab commands and the king obeys, as we saw back at 12. This is after the Nathan situation. This is after he's grieving the death of the love child, and then he's suddenly okay again, and Joab's there in that. And then in a similar situation after Absalom is dead, or Joab says, the troops are wondering why you're crying over their victory, so get back to it or the troops will think they've wasted their energy on you. So in those situations, Joab boldly tells David what to do, but now it's the opposite. Joab prostrated himself with his face to the ground. And notice it's part of this series, as I've been noting here, and we'll see one more in 15:15 outside the frame of our immediate story there, when the people before Absalom, but not with their faces to the ground as we see here, and did obeisance and blessed the king, which is really unusual, and we don't know what that means. If you're a Christian, you might imagine using your hand to draw the sign of the cross over him, but that's obviously not what's happening here. So we know no particular gesture or words or other action, but it's deeply ironic, as we'll see as we look ahead to 18:28, that Ahimaaz cried out to the king as he's watching to see who's coming with tidings after we know Absalom is dead, but the king does not. He cries out, all is well, or shalom there, and he prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground and said, blessed be Yahweh your God, who's delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king, which of course is Absalom, and we can see that scene unfolding. We won't stay with it now. But there it's blessing Yahweh for killing Absalom. And now, in this case, Joab blesses the king for being willing to save Absalom. And as she said, Yahweh saves lives, doesn't kill them. So sorting out who believes the right thing about what Yahweh's views are on life and death is also part of what's going on in the bigger picture of this story. So Joab said after doing that, today your servant or your slave knows that I have found favor in your sight. And we look below and we've seen the finding favor in the sight before was David and Saul's sight twice, and David and King Achish of the Philistine sight. So all three of those were people finding favor in the sight of someone who was threatening to kill them, or at least to kick them out in the case of Achish, to kick them out from the Philistine company, and no further times in the whole Deuteronomistic history. So that pattern suggests that there's underlying hostility here between Joab and David, that now Joab is saying, I might have imagined I was out of your favor, but now I know that I found favor in your sight because you granted my request. But what would that out of favor be? Well, I noted earlier back in chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, David cursed the sons of Jeriah and Joab and his father's house in particular for being too violent for him. Did Joab take that curse seriously, or did he recognize that that was probably a public performance on behalf of the king to disclaim liability for the death of the Saulites? We don't know. Joab plays his own cards close to the vest. All we know is he's claiming this here as if there had been a breach that is now healed, and that the king has granted literally your servant, yes, your servant, doubled there. So with that, Joab sets off, and we'll continue next time as we see what happens when Absalom and David almost come back together. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.